The White House will no longer be welcome there. The president's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is out of a job, as Fox reports this hour. Ahead, complete coverage of how this unfolded, what insiders say about this enormous move, who will take over in his role, and what might change about the Trump presidency. Also, will this do anything to help the Republican rift? The Tennessee Senator Bob Corker openly questioning whether President Trump is stable or even competent to do his job. And other big-name Republicans have recently come forward with criticism of their own. We'll look at the fight between the president and his own party. Plus, Steve Bannon is only the latest insider to leave the administration. We'll look at who's resigned and who the president has forced to leave. It's a big news day. Let's get to it.
Now, Shepard Smith reporting live from the Fox News deck.
Bannon got the boot. Or Bannon resigned, says Breitbart, or it was mutual, says the White House. One of those, but he's out. The controversial chief strategist Steve Bannon no longer at the White House. Of course, Steve Bannon has been nothing short of a lightning rod inside the administration. He's the former Breitbart leader who once described the conservative site as the platform for the alt-right. And once inside the West Wing, there has been no shortage of reports of Bannon taking on other close advisors, including the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. But the rumor mill over Bannon's job really started churning once President Trump made General John Kelly his new chief of staff. General Kelly reportedly expressed his concerns over Bannon to the president. There was also word that some inside the White House believed Steve Bannon was leaking negative stories about the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, whom General Kelly had given more power. Then things really kicked into overdrive this week. On Tuesday, during the stunning news conference, President Trump said this when asked about Bannon's job.
I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist. I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon.
Good man, not a racist, but we'll see. And we do. There's a lot here. The dismissal is fraught with danger for this White House. Remember, Steve Bannon was the architect of the strategy that won candidate Trump crucial states in the Rust Belt. That was all Bannon. He contributed to a book by Joshua Green taking credit for much of the president's success. That, we're told, angered Mr. Trump. There's also been word that the president became furious over an interview Steve Bannon gave to the magazine The American Prospect. In that interview that the magazine posted on Wednesday, Bannon contradicted President Trump's fire and fury threat to North Korea, saying, "There is no military solution here. They got us." In that same interview, Steve Bannon talked about the white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville last weekend and his own role in inflaming the far right. Bannon's response? They're losers and a collection of clowns. Steve Bannon apparently thought his conversation was off the record. The British Daily Mail reported Bannon said he thought the interview was a good thing because it drew fire away from President Trump and his Charlottesville comments. But clearly, not only did Bannon fail to draw fire from the president, he didn't stop the fire for raining down on himself. Breitbart News reports the former Breitbart head submitted his resignation 11 days ago. And on Axios, which broke the news of Bannon's departure, there's a piece right now by Jonathan Swan titled, "Bannon, backed by billionaire, prepares to go to war. War against H.R. McMaster, Dinah Powell, Gary Cohn, and Jared Kushner, and his wife, the first daughter, Ivanka Trump." Axios reports he's told associates he has a killing machine in Breitbart News, and it's possible he returns to lead that site. So he's out, but apparently not silenced. The chief White House correspondent John Roberts is live in Washington for us this afternoon. What are we hearing from inside the administration?
Well, I'm told, Chef, that this wasn't something that was done in the spur of the moment today, that this has been going on now for some time now. Don't know if it goes all the way back to the 6th of August and the report that he tendered his resignation back then, but certainly over the last few days. And I'm told by a source inside the administration that the interview that either the interview or the tirade, whatever you want to call it, that he had with the American Spectator online magazine certainly didn't help. You know, you can't exactly go out there and contradict the president and say you are the knower and seer of all things without the president deciding that, well, maybe you either need to be dressed down a little bit or maybe you need to go out the door. Clearly, though, this is another example of the power that John Kelly, the new chief of staff, has got, because he's reviewing all of the positions inside the White House, and there may be more changes, I'm told, still ahead, and took a look at Bannon and clearly thought that this was not a member of the team that he wanted to have on the team going forward. So that's why we saw the statement from the White House today that said, quote, White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and Steve Bannon have mutually agreed today would be Steve's last day. We are grateful for his service and we wish him the best. Interesting to note that it wasn't the president who made the announcement to say, I have decided that Steve Bannon will no longer be a part of my administration, or Steve Bannon has decided to go and we wish him well. It's John Kelly and Steve Bannon have mutually agreed that today is going to be his last day. Now, as for what President Trump is going to miss, obviously, Steve Bannon was a big connection to the base. He really was sort of the leader of the populist movement there in the White House. But Kellyanne Conway remains at the White House, Shep, as far as we know, and she is in good standing with the president by everything that I've been told. She has a big connection to the base as well, which is why you saw those 19 conservative groups earlier today when wind of Steve Bannon's potential departure started swirling around, saying that Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway are the two people who are faithfully representing the conservative position in the White House. Shep?
This may be a fairly new development, but the situation's been building for months, has it not?
Yeah, you know, Steve Bannon was seen as somewhat untouchable in the early going of the administration, seeing that he was, you know, pretty simpatico with the president on an ideological front. The amount of power that he wielded, the fact that he was instrumental in getting the president elected, that buys you a lot of cachet and a lot of power at the White House. But, you know, he was often talked about in conjunction with Reince Priebus, in tandem with Reince Priebus, that the two of them at some point were going to depart the White House. There are a lot of people who thought that Bannon actually might have departed before now. I was in his office back close to the 100-day mark, and up on two walls were whiteboards with all of the things that he wanted to get accomplished. There were a lot of check marks that were on that wall saying that we've done this, but there were a lot of things that hadn't been checked off, and there was some grumbling in the White House that Steve Bannon's vaunted aggressive agenda wasn't getting through. So perhaps that was not standing him in good stead with the president either, Shep.
These reports of a war brewing between Steve Bannon, now on the outside, and the very closest people in Donald Trump's circle, how much validity is there to this as far as you know?
Well, when you talk about Steve Bannon, one of the things you talk about is his absolute distaste with establishment Republicans and how he wants to fight against them. So for him to go outside and either through Breitbart or maybe teaming up with billionaire Robert Mercer, launching some sort of war against the establishment inside the White House and in Congress wouldn't be too much of a stretch, but it's early going. We don't know what Bannon has decided to do, at least not at this point, Shep.
John Roberts, back with us from Washington. Good to have you back, John. Nice to see you. A Republican senator now questioning whether President Trump has what it takes to lead our nation. The president has been facing bipartisan criticism after he blamed both sides for the violence at the white supremacist neo-Nazi KKK rally in Charlottesville. During those protests, a car plowed into a crowd of counter-demonstrators, killing a woman. Republicans have been distancing themselves from the president's comments, including the Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, who warned that the country faces great peril if President Trump doesn't change his ways.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability, nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina had this to say about President Trump's behavior.
This situation of the last 3 or 4 days, what we've seen is that moral authority being compromised by the lack of clarity, by what we have seen as the pivot backwards, which is very unsettling for many Americans, to include me.
That from Vice News on HBO. President Trump blasting some of the Republican lawmakers who've spoken out against him. In fact, he targeted Lindsey Graham of South Carolina on Twitter, accusing him of spreading lies. And the president tweeted about Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, calling him toxic. We've also gotten word that another presidential advisory group is calling it quits over President Trump's comments on Charlottesville. This morning, members of his Committee on the Arts and Humanities submitted a resignation letter. They also called on the president to resign if he does not see a problem with his comments. Back to John Roberts, live in Washington. John?
Another one of those weeks, Shep, that could have easily been avoided potentially if the president had given a little bit more thoughts to his comments before he put them out there in the public forum. I think he could probably rightly assess that this was one of the worst weeks ever for the president. There was a split in the Republican Party with some people openly defying him before everybody went away for the August recess. But now, as you saw by listening to Corker and Tim Scott, there are some members of the party who are in open revolt against the president, which, according to Newt Gingrich, who was on Fox News this morning in America's Newsroom, said is leaving the president more isolated than he has ever been before. Listen here.
He is much more isolated than he realizes. On the Hill, he has far more people willing to sit to one side and not help him right now. And I think that he needs to recognize that he's taken a good first step with bringing in General Kelly, but he needs to think about what has not worked. And you don't get down in the 35% range of approval and have people in your own party shooting at you and conclude that everything's going fine.
And one of the things that did not work clearly was that press conference that he gave at Trump Tower on Tuesday. Shep, he was supposed to come down, make a statement, and then turn things over to Elaine Chao and Steve Mnuchin. But instead, the president decided to call an audible. And a lot of people would say fumbled the ball badly when he started answering all those questions about Charlottesville.
John Roberts. It's not just lawmakers pushing back against President Trump over his response to Charlottesville. The mother of Heather Heyer, the woman who died Saturday in the violence, says she will not speak to President Trump because of his comments after her daughter's death.
I'm not talking to the president now. I'm sorry. After what he said about my child, and it's not that I saw somebody else's tweets about him. I saw an actual clip of him at a press conference equating the protesters like Ms. Heyer with the KKK and the white supremacists. You can't wash this one away by shaking my hand and saying I'm sorry.
Is there something, though, that
I'm not forgiving for that.
Is there something, though, that you would want to say to the president?
Think before you speak.
President Trump paid tribute to her daughter in a tweet on the day of her memorial service, calling her a truly special young woman who will be long remembered by all. Back to John Roberts at the White House. That's tough stuff.
It is. It's another reason why a lot of people in the White House didn't think it was a particularly good idea for the president on Tuesday at Trump Tower to veer off script. Again, he was supposed to make a statement and then turn things over to Chao and to Mnuchin, but instead he decided he wanted to get something off of his chest. He went all ad lib and took a lot of questions on Charlottesville. His aides knew that if he stayed at the podium, it was going to become about Charlottesville, and it probably wasn't going to end well. The president blaming both sides there, trying to kind of have it both ways, but at the same time denying that he drew any kind of moral equivalence between the protesters on the left and the KKK and the white supremacists, calling out the fake news for misrepresenting what he said. But it's clear, Shep, that a lot of people, not just Heather Heyer's mother, heard it the way they heard it, because there are a lot of members of the president's own party who are really up in arms over what he has said. And this has created a split in the Republican Party, Shep, that is going to be very difficult to repair when those members of Congress come back here to Washington after Labor Day.
It is really hard to imagine, as one person told me this morning, that he'll be able to get any legislative accomplishments in the current state of affairs after the summer break.
That said, though, when people like Corker and Tim Scott are asked, are you going to vote yes or no on tax reform, the president will probably get the result that he wants. It may be on some of the thornier issues, though, that he has a bigger problem.
John Roberts, thanks again.
Thanks.
Steve Bannon's exit could shake up some White House policies. That's according to our next guest, who says we could see big changes in everything from Trump's tax plans to national security. And he also says President Trump is taking a real chance with this move. We'll explain why in detail coming up from the Fox News Deck on this Friday afternoon. More now on Fox Top Story. Steve Bannon out at the White House. Josh Gerstein is here. He's a senior reporter for Politico. Thanks, Josh.
Hey, Shep, good to be here.
Pretty big move, fraught with peril.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big move in that it could have impacts in a lot of different policy areas where Steve Bannon was seen as the one sort of holding the line for some of the Trump campaign policies, for some of the more populist policies in areas like taxes, for example, probably in the area of the military as well. Bannon was a real skeptic about some of these long wars that the U.S. is engaged in Afghanistan and Iraq, and maybe even causing Trump to hold the line on immigration. We could see moves on all that stuff, but don't think Bannon is out of this picture because he's out of the White House. In a sense, he might be more of a danger and more of an influence to the administration on the outside than he was kind of marginalized on the inside as he was for the last few months.
Axios writes of a preparation for war with a billionaire backer against members of the president's own family and others.
Yeah, I mean, and we're already seeing members of the right who are angry about some of the things going on in this White House. I saw Mike Flynn's son lashing out on Twitter against this move to fire Bannon, and again taking shots at the current National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. And so we could just see all of that really intensify if Bannon leaves and joins directly in those efforts through the Breitbart platform or many of the other folks like Mercer that he's close to.
Mercer, a billionaire donor.
Right, a very prominent donor on the right who has supported groups like Breitbart, has supported a number of other media outlets that have been supportive of the president, at least towards the end of his campaign, and basically could offer Breitbart unlimited funds to mount whatever additional efforts he may pursue to try to keep Trump to some of the themes that he struck during the campaign and avoid him falling into what Breitbart calls the globalist camp.
In a war, as Axios puts it, against, among others, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, how's that going to go over?
Well, I don't know. You know, the president hasn't really, I think, defended them publicly to the degree he might have. But this is a war that's been going on for a long time. I mean, there's been this constant sniping back and forth between the Jared and Ivanka camp and the Bannon camp. In the press, how much of it is dictated by Bannon is hard to tell. How much is coming from his allies. But to have that come out in front of the curtain, I think, could be very unpleasant for everyone involved. Already people on Bannon's side are saying now the president is left to the Democrat White House, implying that Jared, Ivanka, Gary Cohn, and others really don't have the president or the Republican Party's best interests at heart.
There are as many stories as you want about how this went down. Breitbart is reporting that Steve Bannon submitted his resignation on August the 6th. The White House is saying that it was a mutual agreement with the new chief of staff. Others have said he was dismissed. Do we know what the truth is?
Well, we know that the Bannon had been marginalized within the White House for several months. I mean, the writing had been on the wall. In some sense, the question was when would the president lance this boil and deal with a problem that he needed to deal with for a long time. I think it had really been decided effectively from the point where John Kelly was brought on as chief of staff. There was just no sense that these two men were going to be able to mesh and work together. And then you had these interviews this week where Bannon just seemed to be way off the reservation in terms of making public comments. So that seemed to just put the nail in the coffin on this.
Josh Gerstein from Politico. Thank you, sir.
Sure, Shep.
More Republican lawmakers coming out against President Trump's comment that both sides